Julie Murphy, president of Sage Communications, talks to host Doug Simon on PR's Top Pros Talk.
Julie, can you share the difference from your perspective of working with a government client or, say, an enterprise client that has business with the government?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm so glad you started with that because I always think it's really important to define what sort of segment of government PR we're talking about. Because oftentimes when people hear government PR, they think of political campaigns or maybe lobbying. And what we're talking about here are businesses. I primarily work with large technology companies that are selling into the federal government. So there's a tremendous opportunity for tech and government because we like to call it Fortune One. It's spending north of $100 billion to either maintain or modernize its technology infrastructure. And so it's really quite different from your typical B2B enterprise, especially from a messaging standpoint.
Yeah, so how do federal mandates and policy influence funding and how you work with these clients and support them?
Policy in terms of federal mandates or it can be directives come out a few different ways. So Congress can put out funded legislation that oftentimes sort of dictates or guides agencies on certain missions that they need to meet. You also have the president often will put out executive orders, and we've worked on several of those over the past few years in terms of our clients that fit into some of his priorities, and also even at a federal agency level. So often you can have either CISA, which is the cybersecurity agency at DHS, OPM, a lot of times NIST. They'll put out even directives at an individual agency level. And it really, from a PR standpoint, offers a huge opportunity for companies that are trying to work with this space. And so, in particular, I also want to mention in the federal government where companies often have trouble, because sometimes it helps to start with where are the challenges. It's when they're treating it like any other business entity, that's primarily for-profit organizations. And when you're selling into the federal government, they have a very different mission. They're public servants trying to carry out public missions that serve the public interest. And so therefore, the culture is very different. And if you come in and start talking about business laden messages like increasing your profit margins, it really is almost a faux pas. So you really have to understand the culture of government and sort of where they're being influenced and what their day-to-day mission looks like in order to sort of reflect that in the PR strategy.
Yeah, and a message that's clearly out there with the recent election is that there might be a change in culture in the government, at least in how it's discussed at a minimum. How do you sort of navigate what seem like these huge changes overnight? I'm sure it's a topic that everyone in your area is discussing.
Yeah, and so whenever there's especially a presidential election, when there are these times of change, there is sort of everyone has their eyes on the headlines of what's going on. And there's a lot of noise. And I would say from a company that's selling into the government space, keep in mind that these are companies that have sometimes worked with federal agencies for decades, and also working with civil servants. The vast majority of government employees, probably close to 99%, are not political appointees. So they spend their entire career in government in sort of a nonpartisan capacity to implement the policy and the mandates. And so in terms of what to look for in this transition, usually major sweeping changes take actually a long time to come to fruition because remember, even say if a president puts out an executive order or puts out it doesn't necessarily get funded until it goes through Congress. The same with presidential appointees. So we're sort of in this time frame now where there's transition, where you just really need to keep an eye on it and remain agile because we don't really know yet how it's going to play out. I would also say from a technology standpoint, and that's really where sort of I operate, tech policy, things like cybersecurity historically has been pretty bipartisan. So during Trump's initial administration, there were cybersecurity policies. Biden, which put out a cybersecurity EO, which a lot of our clients were able to provide expertise to media on the cybersecurity EO. And national security will continue to be a priority. So we'll just have to sort of wait and see how things play out. Another example from a tech policy standpoint could be artificial intelligence, obviously,
Right.
an area of technology that's emerging very fast. President Biden put out a secure and trustworthy AI executive order that started to begin putting some guardrails around how do we take advantage of this really great technology while still protecting it from any risks that could be involved. So it has been reported that President Trump may rescind that. However, it wasn't a major talking point on the campaign trail
Right.
in terms of what he wants to do with AI. So right now, it's still sort of unknown how that could potentially play out. So I think the key thing is just to remain agile and to see what actually comes to fruition. Because again, a lot of times it takes some time for these things to move down through the bureaucracy. It's not going to be on day one that a lot of these things come to fruition.
Yeah, and to your point, for these businesses, it's not like every contract with the government ends on inauguration day of a new president. Some of these are multi-year projects that have already been funded. So even if you want to make change, you're midway through things that sort of are funded and have the money to be continued. So there's that inertia factor that affects it too. Um, Given that, and the air of change that is being talked about, any advice on your communication strategy, maybe even approaching government related media? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what you mean by government related media and how to reach them.
Sure. And again, like going back to, and you're right, by the way, a lot of contracts are multi-year. A lot of contracts really are nonpartisan and make up the functioning of our government. I like to think of our federal workforce as the unsung heroes because a lot of times they spend decades of their career and they're the ones who are sort of keep the machine running regardless of who's in office. And so, in terms of advice for companies who are would like to increase their awareness and credibility in this space, I would say there's a public relations can make a huge impact. And it's because it's such a news-driven environment. We talk about different policies that are coming out, different items as it relates to technology trends. And there's a huge opportunity from a rapid response standpoint to sort of exponentially increase your coverage and exposure. So I would say for companies to really think about what area they want to focus on. So if it's cybersecurity, there's a lot of policy, not just from a political standpoint, but even from organizations like CISA, which is a cybersecurity agency at DHS. There's
Hmm.
and others that are the DoD. They're all putting out guidelines around cyber. And if you have a particular expertise where you can really help solve some of these challenges or sort of help break down what exactly the government is looking for, you can be a great expert source for a lot of this government media. The other thing I would mention, because you had noted that the best ways to approach government media, it's similar to the messaging, right? And so, you've got to speak in a language and sort of understanding the culture of government of what's going to be important to these government reporters. So I personally find when companies are having a hard time sort of generating the news coverage in this space, it's because they're talking about themselves too much. So the
Right.
government publications aren't interested in your merger or acquisition or your new executive hire, or sometimes, but really,
Yeah, if it's significant enough, is interest.
yeah, that you have to break into the news of what's going on in government. I have another, if you'd like another example, I
Sure.
work with and this sometimes goes outside of policy. So I'm sure you've been following the pending ban of TikTok in the US for national
Of course.
security, which would probably of interest to your listeners being in the PR. So I work with a mobile cybersecurity company who they aren't necessarily saying whether the US should or should not do this, but they can shed light on, well, what exactly is the threat to national security?
Right.
How is the data being used? And what does it mean if someone owns that data that doesn't need to abide by US laws? And what can I do to secure my mobile device? If I'm a government employee, how do I make sure that I can lock down my own mobile phone or whatever endpoint device I'm using? And so that's how you can really increase your awareness in the space to be of use and to help sort of break down and clarify some of these conflict or complex and sort of very long-winded sort of documents that we sometimes see from government.
Cool. Well, I appreciate the thoughtful conversation. One topic we had discussed in people talk about influencers, you know, is there still an influencer network in government? And is it not necessarily the person who does a phenomenal job putting on their makeup in the morning, how do influencers in the government sector, especially in this mode of if there's an anti-expert, if you will, and debate about what the truth is on many things, where it's become more of a spectrum than a specific piece. What type of influencers are you looking to either target or work with?
Right. It's a great question. I would argue that the government is one of the most networked, one of the biggest industries that has influencers. I know when we typically think of influencers, we are thinking about what you're sort of referring to in terms of, makeup brands or other celebrities maybe that are carrying a particular bag. But in the government space, this is a very well networked and niche community. There are several industry organizations where groups come together, working groups, public-private sector type of working groups that come together where a lot of business relationships are built. So from an audience standpoint, there's just so many different types of people that sort of enter the government buying process at different times that you need to get in front of. Another important influencer in government a lot of times is your former government official. Now, there are rules around how
Right.
soon government can do this. There's a cooling off period, but once it's legal for them to do that, these are individuals who've spent decades of their career in government. They understand the mission, they understand the complexities, and they can really help to open doors. So a lot of times companies will hire these individuals to sit in an advisory capacity. From a PR standpoint, we've also used them as additional spokespeople to be able to sort of shed light on some of the things that are happening.
Yeah, and they also have an opportunity to increase their earnings compared to what they get as a government employee. Is there anything you'd like to say to close, a final thought you'd like to leave with our viewers?
Yeah, I would just say that if you're working with a company or represent a company that is selling into government, get to know the industry culture. It really is a different culture in the federal government. You've got to immerse yourself in it. There's a huge opportunity for PR to have an impact because there's really so much news. And again, I would just like to give a shout out to the government employees that spend decades of their career working on the mission. And we often think of when you think of a sense of duty, it's usually with a culture like the military, but I've really found that permeates across government. So whether it's someone working at NASA that is passionate about space exploration and expanding human knowledge, or someone at the Center for the Disease Control, the CDC, that's interested in safeguarding public health. It really is a unique environment where the mission comes first. And if you can sort of shape your strategy to fit into that environment, you can be very successful.
Yeah, that's great. And we had an opportunity yesterday to work with someone in government who's involved in helping make the public aware not to be buying counterfeit products this holiday season and how to go about figuring that out. And just the sense of mission and pride that they had. It was really, exhilarating to partner with them, as it's been to have this chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And one more thing I'll add, I'd like to give kudos to the Washington Post did a series this year. It's called Who is Government? You can find it on their website or Google it, where they sort of talk about exactly what you're talking about, going deep in these agencies, showing the mission work that they're doing that is really very interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Of course.